Hello, I am Brooke Clement, and as Acting Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's virtual program, Slavery in the President's Neighborhood. In addition to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, I want to thank the White House Historical Association for co-sponsoring tonight's event. Before we begin, let me make a pitch for some of our upcoming programs. On February 11th, we will be welcoming Dr. David Hamilton Golland to discuss his book, A Terrible Thing to Waste, Arthur Fletcher and the Conundrum of the Black Republican. Dr. Golland received the 2010 Gerald R. Ford Foundation Travel Grant for research completed at the Ford Library in Ann Arbor for this book. In March, we have two programs in the works. Catherine Grace Katz will join us for a virtual program to discuss her book, The Daughters of Yalta, and we will be partnering with the White House Historical Association to host a virtual Easter egg roll. This event will be perfect for families. Watch your emails or visit our website for registration information for all future programs. Please join me in welcoming Claire Schubert, Director of Engagement and Programming with the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, to introduce tonight's speakers. Claire?
Thanks very much, Brooke. And on behalf of the Gerald R. Ford Foundation, I'd also like to welcome everyone joining us tonight for this special and very important program presented by the White House Historical Association. In 2016, Michelle Obama famously commented, "I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves, and I watch my daughters, two beautiful, intelligent Black young women, playing with their dogs on the White House lawn." I think this quote says a lot about where America came from and where we're going. Many people think of the White House as a symbol of democracy, but it is also part of our country's history of slavery. From its construction until emancipation took effect in Washington, D.C., men, women, and children labored under the oppression of slavery in the People's House. Launched by the White House Historical Association in February of 2020, the Slavery in the President's Neighborhood Research Initiative seeks to identify enslaved and free African Americans who built, lived, and worked at the White House and bring their voices and their stories to the historical forefront. Tonight, senior historian Dr. Matthew Costello and historian Lina Mann will discuss the initiative as well as some of their discoveries thus far as they seek to uncover and share these stories. I can tell you that I've spent quite some time on the site and found myself so engrossed in the fascinating stories of some really fascinating people. I also want to let our viewers know that Matt and Lina will be taking audience questions at the end of the program. So please feel free to use the Q&A box on your Zoom screen or the comment section on Facebook, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those questions as possible. But now I'd like to tell you a little bit more about this evening's presenters. Matthew Costello joined the association in November 2016 after completing his Ph.D. and MA in American history at Marquette University. His book, The Property of the Nation, George Washington's Tomb, Mount Vernon, in the Memory of the First President, was published by University Press of Kansas in fall 2019 and was a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. Lina Mann first joined the White House Historical Association in 2017 as American University's Public History Fellow and came on board as a historian in March 2020. She is interested in many different aspects of White House history, including her latest research on the enslaved individuals that built, lived, and worked in the White House. Matt and Lina, thank you so much for joining us tonight and for the very important work that you do. I will see you after your presentation for some audience Q&A, but for now, the floor is yours. Welcome.
All right. Well, thank you guys for having us tonight. We're really excited to be here. And I just want to say that I'm really excited because a year ago yesterday, we officially launched Slavery in the President's Neighborhood. So it's been a full year now, and the initiative tells the stories of the enslaved and free African Americans that, of course, as Claire mentioned, built, lived, and worked at the White House. And we've come at it with the approach of, while we know that there's often few written accounts of enslaved people's experiences, we do know that their voices can be found in so many different sources, including letters, newspapers, memoirs, census records, architecture, oral histories. And by connecting all of these details, we have really sought to return these individuals and intertwine their life stories with the lives of presidents, first families, and first ladies. So to start out this research, the association, we took a closer look at presidents that relied on enslaved labor at the White House. But in addition to talking about slavery at the White House, we also expanded out that research to look at slavery in the surrounding president's neighborhood and the broader Washington, D.C. area. And since many people think of the White House as this symbol of democracy, it is really important to note and remember that it has a really complicated past and the paradoxical relationship that does exist between slavery and freedom occurs there. So in order to share our research with the public, we launched an accompanying website, and here is what the homepage looks like. And I just want to take a minute to show you some of the features before we get into some of these stories. So as you click into the site from this homepage, you will find a number of resources, including an index of all the known enslaved individuals that worked at the White House. Right now, the list is over 300 people. A section for frequently asked questions, a page with additional resources about slavery and the presidency, and this also includes good resources for teachers and students. And then finally, a virtual tour of the historic slave quarters at Decatur House, which is the site of the only existing urban slave quarters within sight of the White House, and is also where the White House Historical Association has our offices. So in addition to all of these resources, the main features of this initiative are the interactive timeline. This portion of the website features a number of articles about enslaved individuals in a timeline scrollable format. So you can click out to articles or click on pop-outs to learn more information about important events in American history and in the history of slavery. So the intent with establishing this site was to create something interactive, but also something that would clearly represent the information. And we have kind of three types of articles. So we have more general pieces that provide overview or tie into broader historical conversations. Second, we have household articles, which are kind of guide you through, and these articles address every president that has owned or hired out enslaved individuals. And these also help orient users to time period. And then finally, and most importantly, we have articles about individuals. And this is sort of the heart of the initiative. This is where we seek to explore the lives of those that have so often been ignored. So all of these articles can be accessed at our website, which is whitehousehistory.org. And if you get to our homepage, you should be able to get right to this page as well. And now I want to turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, Lina. So the impetus for a lot of this work and this research, it ties into the quote that Claire mentioned in the beginning of her introduction that was made by First Lady Michelle Obama. She first made this statement at a commencement at City College of New York in June 2016. She would go on to add it to her speech at the Democratic National Convention that summer. But you know, this very prophetic statement, "I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves," which of course, that was the most memorable line that a lot of people took away from the First Lady's speech. It prompted immediate fact checking by conservative and liberal outlets who wanted to know, was this exactly true? How true was it? And as you can imagine, yes, there is a lot of historical truth in the statement that the White House was built by slaves. Some people wanted to say that, well, it wasn't exclusively slaves, but the First Lady didn't say that. So it was more or less about making a statement about what it meant to see her young Black daughters playing on the White House grounds and knowing that they were living in this historic place that at one point was built, maintained, and taken care of by enslaved people, which is very much a part of the legacy of African-American history in this country. So what we decided to do was, because so many people were interested in learning more about slavery in the White House, and of course so many people came to our website looking for more information, we decided to create a new initiative where we would dig deeper into this to try to not only tabulate and identify how many people that we could who worked at the White House, lived at the White House under slavery, but then also be able to tell their stories, whether it's the individuals, the marriages, the children, or sometimes the stories, we can trace them all the way to freedom. and other times we can't. And that's sort of one of the many heartbreaking things about doing this research is, yes, identifying these people and sharing their stories is important, but oftentimes it doesn't turn out nearly as positively as you might hope. So this is an early map of Washington, D.C., just to give you a sense of the geography of the space. It's not really all that surprising that slavery was used for constructing the public buildings in Washington. Remember, at this point in time, the nation's capital was in Philadelphia, which was a well-established city. It had been, constructed, and as as part of the Residence Act of 1790, they decided to build a new national capital, and it was built on land previously owned by two states that permitted slavery, Maryland and Virginia. And as a result, the people who were here, the landowners who were here, many of them were slave owners, and many of them hired out enslaved people to work on the public buildings projects in order to get the national capital ready in time for the government to move in 1800 as dictated by the law. Now, construction begins in the President's House. The cornerstone is laid October 13, 1792. And for the next 8 years, hundreds of enslaved and free African Americans, immigrant laborers, local and foreign craftsmen labor to build the White House. Now, quantifying this workforce is very difficult for several reasons. The number of workers was constantly changing depending on the time of the year and the phase of construction. There was constant movement of workers between the White House and the Capitol. Remember, the White House is actually a fairly small structure in comparison to the Capitol. So the Capitol would have required more laborers on site. But depending on what kind of activities were going on, whether you needed stone setters, stone cutters, if you needed bricks to be made, you might be shuffling people back and forth. The recruitment of workers, or lack thereof, often resulted in the hiring out of more enslaved workers. So the payroll records sometimes aren't as consistent as we might hope. And while there are payroll records, these only tell part of the story. They can help us identify names and occupations, but things like race and ethnicity were not consistently recorded. Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. So we have to use other context clues. So things such as occupation, the listing of the first and last name, whether or not an individual's wages were signed for by someone else, or if they signed for them themselves, how many days a month they worked. We can use these different bits of information to try to determine who these individuals were and what their social status might have been at that point in time. Now, generally speaking, the signature of someone else's name suggests that that person was their owner, signing for wages on behalf of their enslaved worker. This wasn't always the case, but it does suggest the possibility, which then leads to more research on the person who signed. And usually what we found is that those individuals were slave owners, and we find their signatures across different payrolls over time. Next slide. So here we have a list of presidents that used enslaved labor at the White House and presidents that owned enslaved people at some point during their lives. So we know for certain at least 9 American presidents used enslaved labor at the White House. There are probably not many surprises, but there are a couple. John Quincy Adams, who's really thought of as to be very anti-slavery. He had actually brought his wife's nephew and niece into the White House, and they had inherited slaves from their parents. So at some point, there were enslaved workers living in the John Quincy Adams White House, even though he didn't hire them, he didn't own them. But it does go to show you just how complicated slavery could really be, because oftentimes these things came through families, they came through inheritance. And in some ways, everybody had a relationship with slavery, even somebody like John Quincy Adams, who denounced it for most of his life. And then, of course, we have presidents that owned enslaved people at some point. I think most people are surprised to see Ulysses S. Grant on the list as well. They think of him as the leader of the Union Army, who led the Union forces to victory in the Civil War. Ulysses S. Grant had actually worked on his father-in-law's plantation in Missouri called Whitehaven, and he had worked with enslaved workers. And at some point, he had come into owning a man. He later gave him his freedom, but even Ulysses S. Grant, at some point, had become bound up in the institution of slavery. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Lina.
All right. So to get us started with talking about some of these more personal stories, I wanted to highlight some of these payrolls that we're talking about. One of the cool projects that I've had a chance to do is I got a chance to go through payrolls for work that was done on the White House grounds during the presidency of James Monroe. And in doing that, I uncovered the names of some 32 enslaved individuals that were involved in that project. These payrolls exist on microfilm within the National Archives, and they detail these construction projects that occurred on the White House grounds from around 1818 to 1834. And it makes sense that these various renovations occurred because at the time it was just after the White House had been rebuilt following being burned down by the British during the War of 1812. So this is definitely a big time of big movement on the White House grounds. They were constructing new walls and gates, coppering the roof of the White House, and then also doing grading in the President's Square in front of it, which is today Lafayette Park. And the payroll that I'm going to show here shows the use of enslaved labor. So very similar system to what Matt just described with the original construction of the White House is also occurring here for work on the White House grounds. We know that this list consists of free white, free black, and also enslaved Black people all working on these projects. However, it is possible to determine based on looking at who is signing for the wages. If it is a different name, that is an indication that it is being signed for by the slave owner rather than the enslaved person. So if you look closer here at my next slide, zoom in, there is a notation for Rich S. Briscoe's Chaz, which is short for Charles. And the fact that this individual is noted as belonging to someone else directly on the payroll makes it abundantly clear that Charles was enslaved. Sometimes you will see their names just being different from the slave owner, but in this case, we have an indication of ownership directly in the payroll. And you can see that R.S. Briscoe signed, taking home $1 a day for 14 days that Charles worked. And additionally, if you look into congressional appropriations for that year, for 1818, you can see that Congress set aside $15,214 for these construction projects. And some of this federally allocated money did go to pay laborers, and that include enslaved laborers' owners. So although it is very difficult to trace these individuals, we do know that it is easier to trace their owners since those owners tended to be white, wealthy men that were elites in Washington, D.C. And luckily, these records are very intact. So I did some genealogy research that indicated that Briscoe was a man named Richard S. Briscoe. He resided in Washington, D.C. And census records like the one here indicate that he was living with 7 enslaved individuals in 1820. Making it very likely that he is the same person that hired out Charles. And what's most interesting about Charles himself is that his last name is revealed on later payrolls. So when he appeared again on a payroll in November of 1819, he was recorded instead as Charles Shade, with R.S. Briscoe still signing for those wages. And the recording of an enslaved person's name really varies, so I thought this was interesting. Often enslaved individuals are listed with their owners' last names, but it also could be that they have a separate name that's just not recorded on these payrolls. And it's really interesting that his last name does appear. It also makes it easier potentially to trace him specifically with that last name. Unfortunately, I haven't found any additional information about him yet, but I do hope that we can in the future uncover some more about him. And as with all research for this initiative, it's still ongoing. And so I think this is a good example of, we can learn and glean little bits and pieces, but it could also ultimately take a lot of time to find the right documents that reveal a full picture of someone's life. And I'll turn it back over to Matt.
So what we'd like to do before we get into audience Q&A is just sort of highlight 3 figures and their stories and some of the research that came out of the initiative, specifically about John Freeman, Paul Jennings, and Elizabeth Keckley. So the first individual is John Freeman, and actually this is a photograph of his grandson, John Freeman Shorter, who would go on to serve in the 55th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry during the American Civil War. As you can imagine, most enslaved, there are very few pictures of enslaved people. So more often than not, we have to rely on other types of sources and documentation to learn more about them. And even for things like a visualization, sometimes we rely on future family members. And so that's why we have this image of John Freeman Shorter. John Freeman had actually been hired out to the Jefferson White House by his owner, Dr. William Baker, a Maryland physician, for $8 a month. Jefferson was paying to Dr. Baker for Freeman's labor at the White House. And while he was there, Freeman's duties included waiting at the dining table, taking care of the hall and dining room, and possibly attending to the president personally, although we know that Jefferson generally avoided having a valet. Freeman quickly became one of the president's favorites and routinely accompanied him on his trips back to Monticello. And it was on one of these trips to Monticello in 1803 that Freeman fell in love with a woman named Melinda Colbert. Melinda was also enslaved. She was enslaved in the household of Jefferson's daughter, Maria Epps. And John Freeman expressed his desire to marry her. When Mrs. Epps died in 1804, Freeman feared that Melinda would be sold and they would be separated forever. So he wrote a letter to Jefferson, which you can see on the left here, imploring him to be so good as to keep us both. That is, he asked Jefferson to purchase both him and Melinda so they could stay together. Jefferson agrees to purchase John Freeman, but he will not necessarily purchase Melinda at this time. The condition that he does so is that Freeman will get his freedom in 1815, as was originally promised by his current owner, Dr. Baker. And then he says he's not going to purchase Melinda because he said that there were already too many servants in idleness at Monticello, and that for the White House, he preferred white servants who, when they misbehave, can be exchanged. I think most people assume that Jefferson only had an enslaved workforce, but he, like many of the presidents, had a mixed force of free and enslaved staff. And he saw advantages to having certain positions held by enslaved people and other positions held by free people who were paid. And if he was unhappy with their job performance, he could fire them and hire somebody else. So when Jefferson agrees to do it, he purchases it, and then in 1809, when his term is over, he's preparing for retirement back in Monticello. And by this point in time, Melinda has been given her freedom, and she lives in Washington, D.C. And so now there's this fear of John Freeman having to go back to Monticello and having to leave behind his wife and children. And also at this point in time, if you went back to Virginia and you were a formerly enslaved person, there were actually laws already in place that could make you vulnerable to being re-enslaved. So the last thing John wanted was Melinda to come back into Virginia. So instead, Freeman again pleads with Jefferson, and this time it works. He actually gets Jefferson to agree to sell him to the incoming president, James Madison, so that he can stay in Washington, D.C. with his family. Jefferson calculated out the value of the remaining 6 years on Freeman's contract, which was a total of $231.81. President Madison would go on to free John Freeman in 1815, according to the terms of the contract originally set out by Dr. Baker. And he would actually work for Jefferson as a paid dining room attendant until the end of his presidency. He would go on to work at Gatsby's National Hotel as a messenger for the State Department. He and his wife both became active in the anti-slavery work of Washington's free Black community. And they raised 8 children together. They ended up purchasing a home on K Street, several blocks from the White House. And their grandson, John Freeman Shorter, pictured here, would go on to fight to abolish slavery in the American Civil War. The next figure, Paul Jennings, is probably the most famous or most recognizable enslaved person who worked at the White House. Certainly you've heard the story of Dolly Madison and the saving of the George Washington portrait during the War of 1812. But the story is a little bit more complicated than simply Dolly saving the portrait herself. Jennings' story begins at Montpelier, which was the Madison plantation and estate. He was born in 1799 and trained from an early age first to look after the Madison's son. And then he went with the family when James Madison was elected president. He went to Washington, D.C. to serve as a valet and a dining room servant at the president's house. Now, it was during the Madison administration that he performed a pretty heroic act that for a long time he and others didn't necessarily get credit for. It was August 24th, 1814. And the British had actually marched on the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., and they had set fire to many of the government buildings. This included the United States Capitol, the Treasury Building, the executive offices, and the White House. Next slide, please. So you've probably seen it. It's the iconic Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington. It was painted in 1797. It was there at the White House when John Adams walked in November 1800 to greet him. And it's the only item still on display in the White House today that predates the fire of 1814. And what's really interesting is in the aftermath of this national calamity of destroying a nascent nation's capital, there are these stories that come out of it about Dolly Madison saving the portrait. Some go so far as to say that she cut it out of the frame, and it becomes sort of like this great piece of American folklore. And in a way, it's an act of preservation, and it's a legacy piece. It's something that the Madisons then hold on to as something that they contributed when the country was facing one of its darkest moments. At least they took actions to save something that was so significant and so important to the country. As it turns out, Paul Jennings was involved in it. In 1865, he publishes what is entitled A Colored Man's Reminiscences of James Madison. And it's Jennings' account of his life working for the Madisons, but also his time in Washington, D.C., including he does talk about the rescuing of the George Washington portrait. He points out that a number of people have tried to take credit for it, and they're just that there's no credence to their claims. But he also points out that Dolly Madison gave the order for the portrait to be saved, and then she vacated the house. It was left to the White House staff, which included Jennings, the steward of the house, Jean-Pierre Soussaint, the gardener, Thomas McGrath, and then actually two gentlemen from New York, Jacob Barker and Robert D.L. DePeyster. This group of individuals were still in the house when Dolly Madison ordered them to save the portrait, and then she fled because she thought the British were imminently going to be marching on the president's house. So it's a great story because not only does it shed more light on probably the most, I would say, significant, most remembered, most recollected story of White House history, but also it just goes to show you that African Americans were there. They were there for the construction. They were there for working in the White House day to day. They were even there for some of these really key critical moments in our country's history. And that it's really up to us to shed more light on their activities, their actions, what they did, and to tell a more comprehensive story so people understand the entirety of the history.
All right. For our final story today, I wanted to highlight the really extraordinary life of Elizabeth Hobbs Keckley. She's a really fascinating figure. And she was born into slavery and then gained her freedom later. She moved to Washington, D.C., established a seamstress business. She befriended Mary Todd Lincoln and became the First Lady's dressmaker, and then later published her own memoir. And I think her story is a really great one to tell because in this case, we actually have her autobiography, much like we know about Paul Jennings' experiences because of his writings. And we're actually able to know her life story through her eyes, which is very valuable in telling these stories. And I find her story fascinating because we are able to better understand the horrors of slavery. Her experience is filled with really awful circumstances, including abuse, rape, sexual assault, family separation. Her story really has so many horrific items in it. And we know that her experience was not uncommon. So her experience reflects what a lot of enslaved people experienced. And so I want to highlight that here. So she was born in February of 1818 in Virginia, and even the circumstances surrounding her birth are complex. Evidence suggests that her birth was likely the result of a rape by her enslaver, Colonel Armistead Burton. Burwell. And despite the fact that her biological father was her owner, Elizabeth's mother, a woman named Agnes or Aggie, she did have a husband, another enslaved man named George Hobbs. And George was very devoted to his family, even though they lived on separate plantations, which is pretty common among enslaved marriages. And while Elizabeth was still young, George, he was actually extremely briefly brought to live with them on the same plantation, just to have him sold away shortly afterwards. And it seems like it might have been some sort of thing just to pull the rug out from under Agnes. But Elizabeth recorded the painful reaction to this event in her memoir, and it's really heartbreaking. She says, "I can remember the scene as if it were but yesterday. How my father cried out against the cruel separation, his last kiss, his wild straining of my mother to his bosom, the solemn prayer to heaven, the tears and sobs, the fearful anguish of broken hearts, the last kiss, the last goodbye, and he, my father, was gone forever." So this is a very common experience. A lot of enslaved families were separated at some point. And then at the age of 14, Elizabeth was then separated from her mother for a time when she was sent to live with Burwell's son, Robert, in North Carolina. So she went to North Carolina, and in this household, she experienced more horrific things. She was beaten severely with no discernible provocation. She was also repeatedly raped by a white store owner named Alexander Mackenzie Kirkland. And just like her mother before her, one of these incidents resulted in a pregnancy, and her son George was named after her, the man she considered her father, George Hobbs. And she wrote about his birth, and also really heartbreaking quote. She said, "If my poor boy ever suffered any humiliating pangs on account of birth, he could not blame his mother, for God knows she did not wish to give him life. He must blame the edicts of that society which deemed it no crime to undermine the virtue of girls in my then position." So eventually, Elizabeth was able to escape this household. She returned to Virginia and then met up with her mother again. And her mother, Agnes, and her went west with their new owners, Burwell's daughter and her husband, Anne and Hugh Garland. She lived in St. Louis with them for 12 years, and she really helped support them. It seems that Garland was not great with money, and so she actually used her seamstress skills to support the family during that time. She also married a man named James Keckley, but she did not stay with him, and the details surrounding that are unclear, but she did write this sentence in her autobiography, which I thought was really great. She says, this is all she says about him. She says, "With the simple explanation that I lived with him 8 years, let charity draw him a mantle of silence." So it probably didn't end very well. And then she asked the Garlands for her freedom. They initially declined, but then agreed to it if she paid it off. She was eventually able to do so by asking her white women clients to help her out, and then she paid them back later. And then she moved to DC and set up a new seamstress business where she quickly caught the attention of Washington's elite women. And that included a number of interesting, famous women, including Verena Davis, who is the wife of Jefferson Davis. In a rather extraordinary retelling, Keckley states that Verena actually asked her to go to the South and told Keckley that there would be a war. Keckley chose to remain and ended up instead as Mary Lincoln's seamstress. So she easily could have been seamstress to First Lady of the Confederacy, but ended up staying with Mary Todd. So she ended up getting, a friend recommended her to Mary Todd Lincoln. She showed up at the White House for an interview. She made a dress. She showed up the night of an event for the Lincolns. And originally Mary Todd Lincoln was very upset because it wasn't done soon enough, but they were able to convince her that it was actually a great dress and everything was fine. And so she ended up becoming a seamstress for Mary Lincoln throughout her time in the White House. And then over time, they actually developed an interesting friendship. So after making this first dress, they did work together pretty consistently. They even traveled together. And then Willie Lincoln died in the White House in February of 1862, and Keckley was there. She writes that she helped to dress the body, and that the death really bonded the two women. So Keckley had just lost her own son, George, 6 months prior to this, when he died in a skirmish in Missouri after joining the Union Army. And so they definitely bonded over losing their sons. When Lincoln was assassinated, Keckley actually was one of the first people that Mrs. Lincoln wanted to see. And on the morning of April 15th, a messenger arrived at Keckley's home and took her immediately to the White House to help console the First Lady. And she continued her friendship with Mrs. Lincoln. And the following year, she actually traveled to New York to help Mrs. Lincoln sell a portion of her wardrobe. At the time, Mary Todd Lincoln was in some dire financial straits following the death of her husband. And so this incident actually created a rather large scandal down the line. So after they tripped to New York, they had sort of a falling out, and Elizabeth really was unable to keep up with Mary Lincoln's repeated demands and their friend, and she seemed to sort of take advantage of that friendship. So around this time, Keckley begins writing her own memoir, and she includes, of course, all of the details of her life, and then also the details of this ill-fated dress-selling event in New York. And when this memoir was released publicly, it was not well received. By writing down the story of her own enslavement, but also her intimate conversations with Washington's elite white women, plus her relationship with a First Lady of the United States. Keckley violated a bunch of norms at the same time. So she violated social norms of race, class, gender, and privacy. And the media really attacked her directly and then upheld her as an example of why Black women should be educated. So rather unfortunate series of events. But in her later years, she did recover a bit from this incident. She led a more private life. She continued to sew, and she began training Black seamstresses, and that's what she did with the rest of her life. And she died in 1907 at the age of 89. So a really fascinating life. And she's really a great example of a wide-ranging group of experiences under the condition of slavery. So just want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight to talk about slavery in the President's Neighborhood, and I'm really excited to answer some of your questions.
Okay, thank you, Lina. Thank you, Matt. And I would really encourage all of our viewers, really, this is just kind of the teaser, right? So head to the website, read the stories, make yourself a cup of coffee because you're going to be sitting there for a little while, truly engrossed in these stories. The first question is for both of you. If you could tell us throughout this process, throughout your research, what was the biggest challenge and biggest reward?
Well, the biggest challenge, I think anytime you're doing research related to slavery and enslaved people is just the documentation. Because, generally speaking, slave owners did not teach enslaved people how to read or write. Later, states would pass laws forbidding such a thing. So you're not finding much in terms of diaries, letters, things like that would talk more about the experience of an enslaved person. So instead, you have to rely on a variety of different types of sources, and you kind of have to piece together a narrative. So you look at things like census records, newspapers. You're going to be looking at letters and correspondence of slave owners who perhaps will talk about a particular person or somebody in the household. So you really have to approach those sources extra critically as well, because they're not seeing it as a person, they're seeing it as a property, right? That's how they talk about the person. So I think the biggest challenge is that here we are talking about the most famous landmark in the United States, one of the most famous landmarks in the United States, and there just isn't a lot of documentation that goes back to those early years that really dives into the workforce that was there, aside from things like payroll records. But we know that these types of things exist, and that if we could start kind of pulling these different threads together, that we might be able to create something where people could understand what was that lived experience like. And so, to Lina's earlier point, it involves a lot of research. Sometimes, you can go down the rabbit hole and, you're really thinking that you're going to you're chasing this one document that, it's got to be there and you just don't find it. Then, really the best you can do is we have to sort of speculate. And as long as we have some evidence to build that speculation on, we feel pretty comfortable doing that.
I would also add that one thing that's become, sorry, my dog's making a lot of noise, but one of the things that I've found that has become more difficult over time is as you get, you kind of get emotionally invested in these stories, and they're really, really horrific at times. So it's hard to balance, you know, you want to tell these stories, but also you have to think about, it does take a little bit of an emotional toll on you as well to read a lot of these accounts.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, and you've done a beautiful job sharing these stories and sharing the voices, and we appreciate that. Okay, we have a question from Jim. Jim says, your website says that Scottish stonemasons placed and set the exterior walls. In 1948, the entire interior was gutted and all walls replaced. How much of the original White House was constructed by African Americans, and how much of what is there today how much of what is there today was constructed by African Americans?
Well, the only the parts that really date back to the original 1790s construction are portions of the outer walls, and then different portions of the foundations. In between there, you also had the burning in 1814, which essentially gutted the inside of the White House. They rebuilt it, but instead of using brick the second time around, they opted to use wood because it was cheaper and it was faster. And that was also part of the reason then why, as they continued to renovate the White House, add things like electricity, plumbing, heating and cooling, and then eventually a third floor and a new roof, the weight of those additions took their toll on the interior structure of the house. So by the time Harry Truman was president in 1948, they had to gut the interior of the house. Now, Truman is very clear in his directive. He wants to keep the outer walls. He thinks that those are really important. They're symbolic, they're significant. And so, he orders that the exterior walls of the White House remain standing, and they rebuild the entire interior of the White House, including adding 2 sub-basements. So if you look at the White House today, it only looks like it's 3 stories, but it's actually 6 stories when you count the ground floor and the 2 sub-basements.
We have a couple of questions here wanting to know specifically from Sherry, but we've had a couple of people ask this. Have you been able to connect with descendants of any of the enslaved people who worked in the White House? Have you been able to talk to any living relatives?
A few, yeah. We've had some. We have, first of all, we have a email line out there for if you have any questions or you want to, you have something you want to engage with us on. So we have had some descendants reach out and engage with us on that, and we're hoping to develop that. I think that one of the challenges for us versus sites like Montpelier or Monticello is those are locations where individuals lived their entire lives. There were full families that lived on those plantations. And so it's I think a little bit easier to compile a descendant community and really engage that way. Whereas the White House is, a place where people live temporarily. There is no permanent residence at the White House. So I think it has been a little bit more challenging, but it's something that we're definitely hoping to do more of going forward.
Enid wants to know, do any of the dresses made by Elizabeth Keckley still exist?
Yeah, they do. I know that some museums have them. I actually read an article just yesterday, and I don't remember where it was from, but somebody had just had an Elizabeth Keckley piece on display. So yes, those pieces do still exist.
And a couple of questions about your research. What were the greatest resources for you in the research? Where did you find the documents? Marianne is curious about how certain documents survived all of that time.
I mean, I would say the greatest single repository has to be the National Archives, just because you can find all kinds of materials, and a lot of the early material related to the construction of the White House, and Lina mentioned some of the renovation projects going on in the White House in the 18-teens, 1820s. Those payroll records, those things are kept on microfilm. So because those documents not only have been preserved, but then at some point in time they were processed and put on the microfilm. Now you could simply walk into the National. I mean, if there wasn't COVID. You could walk into the National Archives, you would get your card, and then you would just go to the microfilm room and you could pull out the commissioner's records and start looking through some of these payroll records. And so it's actually very accessible, very easy. And I would think the National Archive has probably the greatest amount of primary source material related to the White House, and then in particular any type of construction projects or staff employment at the White House as well.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Also, like I said, the reason if you notice, two of the stories we told today are more complete because of the autobiographies and memoirs that we do have. So whenever we can find those types of writings, those are really informative when they're written in that voice where you really get their perspective, because then you don't have to do as much piecing together and guesswork. So those resources are definitely my favorite when we are able to see letters written by enslaved people and all of that, anything with their own voice.
And I will say that we've done quite a bit of research beyond the National Archives, even with things like Ancestry.com. We've been doing more genealogical research, especially when Lina was going through and finding names of enslaved people on payroll records who worked in the initial construction. Chances are you're not going to find a single, just a person who's listed by a single name. You're probably not going to find much for that person. But if you can track down their owner and their full name is there because they signed for the wages, chances are you can figure out roughly where they lived. Did they belong to a congregation or church? How long did they live? What was their household made up, because they appear in the census records. So you can start to piece together a little bit more information, especially about these individuals who signed over the labor of multiple enslaved people from their household for the construction projects. And
one little thing to add is the best things I found on Ancestry are actually wills, because the wills show where people went, and that's really helpful to know, whether they were enslaved their entire lives or were they sold at some point. A lot of that information can be gleaned from various records like wills.
Wow, it's fascinating, all of the research and all of the pieces that you were able to put together. I imagine you felt a bit like detectives. We have a couple of people, Marge and Kristen specifically, curious about this surprises. So I'm sure a lot of what you found was expected, but what did you find that really surprised you?
I think one of the for me it was
go ahead.
Sorry. For me it was John Quincy Adams. I think he was a big surprise. I think that he has because of his later work in the House of Representatives, where he was really a champion for abolition and anti-slavery. It was really surprising to find that he did have some enslaved individuals in his house. And as Matt mentioned, it also just demonstrates how pervasive slavery was. Even if you personally took a stance against it, various family connections got in the way for him. So I think that was a really big surprise for me.
Yeah, I think for me, I had always known that the White House was built with enslaved labor. I knew that enslaved laborers were used for construction of the White House and the Capitol. But then I think like many people, just sort of assumed that after that, enslaved labor wasn't used as frequently. And what we found from Lina's research with the payroll records for things like grading the President's Square, putting up fencing and gates and coppering the roof. I mean, these were government projects. And what we found was, enslaved people's names on the payroll. So it just goes to show you that, you can't even really leave slavery just at the construction, because you keep finding it. You keep finding another, and people would often ask, did the government own slaves, or were there like, did the White House own slaves? And it's like, no, that those institutions didn't. But they appropriated money for these projects on the White House, the executive offices, and that money then was divvied out, and enslaved labor was used and contracted out. So in a way, the government didn't own slaves, but the government was paying for enslaved labor to be used.
Next question, how much did abolitionists and others in the early 1800s media highlight the fact that enslaved African Americans were part of the building of the White House? Was this part of their argument for the elimination of slavery?
This is a really good question, and it makes me think of an idea for how to frame an article. I think that that's a really interesting way to look at it. There definitely were abolitionists that did point out these discrepancies. And one of my favorite images was that we've used for the project is an image of an enslaved coffle passing the Capitol building. So a lot of times they focused on the White House and the Capitol building as ways to show this dichotomy and to show that this is a big paradox, that it's the democracy and freedom, but yet not equality.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Washington, D.C. Became sort of a testing ground for a lot of these things, especially in regards to things like abolitionism, emancipation. It's going to be Washington, D.C. that abolishes the slave trade first as part of the Compromise of 1850. But, slave traders can just go over to Alexandria, Virginia, and it's a different state, and they can continue to sell enslaved people there. So, there are ways around these things. It's also, DC is where the first Emancipation Act is put forward and signed by President Lincoln. And I think it's a little over 3,000 African Americans are freed as a result. So what really makes DC unique is that, today it is, of course, our nation's capital, but it's very much rooted in our country's history of democracy, liberty, and freedom. But, a fair amount of this city was built on the backs of enslaved people. And so, when we tell that story, we can't just talk about the symbolism of democracy and freedom without acknowledging that there were many people who were forced, to build these things. And the least we can do is acknowledge them and recognize that this is their capital too. Even if at the time people didn't see it that way, that's the way it should be seen.
Lisa would like to know, do you have any books that you'd recommend for those of us that want to know more about the topic?
I recommend Elizabeth Keckley's memoir for sure. Also Paul Jennings as well. I love to read their words first and foremost. Other really good resources include there is a book by a guy named Bob Arnbeck, who's a historian, and he is what really got me started in looking into how enslaved labor was used to build the White House and the Capitol building. So I think that that's a great little resource to get you started. Matt, do you have any more?
Yeah, I would say if you're looking for a good book on Paul Jennings, Elizabeth Dowling Taylor's book, she's written the definitive biography of Paul Jennings. I would highly recommend that. Annette Gordon Reed, if you're interested in learning more about Jefferson and the Hemmings family. It seems like we're living in a great time where there's at least one great book about each president's family and their relationship with slavery. And then, in some instances, like with Jefferson, his enslaved family that also continue to live at Monticello. And I think what we really want to do with this initiative is that, we've seen that there's great scholarship out there, and it can be pieced up by either historic sites or by administration. And what we want to do is we really want to pull it all together so that people can sort of see the patterns, the continuities, the changes. And so they realize that, slavery, until it's abolished, had a presence in Washington, D.C., at the White House. It sort of peters out by the time of the Civil War. But, even then, we were finding presidents who weren't slave owners who were hiring out enslaved people. So, I mean, it goes to show you that there's so much more to know and so much more to learn. And I think any one of those books would be a good start for anybody who's interested in the topic.
And if you go to our additional resources page, you can find an additional list with some really good ones there.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. And Lina, you mentioned the autobiographies written by Elizabeth Keckley and Paul Jennings. We actually had a question about that. Are those readily available for purchase if someone wanted Elizabeth Keckley's autobiography?
Yeah, they are available for free online for sure. That is how I've accessed them. And then also, I believe the book about Paul Jennings by Elizabeth Downing Taylor, I believe has the text of at least part of the memoir in the back. I think the whole thing though.
Okay. Well, we're nearing the end of our time together, but there's a couple of questions, and I think we're all wanting to know. You've mentioned a few times that this research is ongoing. What's the goal? What's the overarching goal here, and what are the next steps for this project?
Well, I would say that when we started this initiative, we knew that it was going to be an ongoing initiative, that we put a lot of work just getting ready to launch. But we also knew that this was just the beginning. And by bringing more attention to this, by shining more light on it, it was going to spur new research. It was going to get us to look into new things. And also, we hope that more people will contact us and want to know more about their family, and if they believe that their enslaved ancestor worked at the White House. And we want to be there to help people try to figure out those hard research questions, because that's our job. And I would say the ultimate goal is that the White House is the people's house, and that history deserves to be told, and it needs to be inclusive and comprehensive. And this is just the beginning of putting people back in their rightful place in the histories of our country and of our prominent historical landmarks.
Lina, anything you want to add to that?
I think I just would like to engage with the public more. I think that, and it's been a little bit hard because we launched last February. And then of course, I had hoped to be more in person with people this year and talking about this. But I think it's really great. Anytime I get feedback has been really helpful. I've gotten really great emails that have come in that have, helped me to make my research better, to improve how we talk about things. We always want to stay on the forefront. And of course, as this has become really prominent this year, and a lot of people are grappling with our nation's past, I think it's really great to be able to serve as this resource. And I hope that we will continue to be able to do that.
Well, there was a few educators in our audience today, and there was a question about being able to replay this program for students. We are recording tonight's program, and we will have that available on our website that will be accessible. But Matt and Lina, if there are other resources that you want to highlight, especially for educators, and if you could remind all of us your website and where to go to access these materials, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So you can just go to our homepage, www.whitehousehistory.org. And on the main homepage, you'll see one of the boxes for Slavery in the President's Neighborhood. And when you go to it, it'll have the resources that Lina pointed out at the beginning of the presentation. So if you want to see our index of people that we've identified by administration and by construction project, but also then the list of additional resources if you're looking for other books to read. I would highly recommend the virtual tour of the Decatur House slave quarters. I think especially for teachers or educators, it is a 360 photography tour of the space that we serve as stewards of with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And we know that it was turned into an urban slave quarters during the ownership of John Gadsby. And there's remnants of the interiors that date back to that time period. But we tell more about the stories of the people who lived and worked in that space. We present some of the documentation related to their freedom petition requests, and also some of the probate and inventory records of the space. So there's a lot of stuff there if you're interested in learning more about a specific space, but then how we've been able to sort of piece together different stories. And I think it could be a very helpful and visually appealing learning resource for teachers and students.
And one more thing is we do have a classroom resource packet. I believe it should be on our additional resources page for teachers to use in their classrooms.
Excellent. Well, I certainly want to say thank you to the Gerald Ford Foundation and the Gerald Ford Museum and Library But especially to you, Matt and Lina, thank you for joining us this evening, and especially thank you for the important work that you're doing to uncover these stories and to educate other people about really fascinating individuals whose stories deserve to be at the forefront of our history right now. We also want to thank everyone who joined us tonight. By joining us, you made a commitment to learn more about this initiative, about our history, and to learn about some really amazing and previously widely unknown people whose stories deserve to be told. If you enjoyed tonight's program, I'd like to invite you to become a Friend of Ford member. Your membership supports programs like this one tonight, as well as the classes we provide at no cost to schools that teach civics education, as well as promote the values of leadership and service that were so important to President and Mrs. Ford. Not only that, but members have free admission to the Gerald Ford Museum, as well as all of the other National Archives presidential museums throughout the country. And to really sweeten the deal, those who sign up in the month of February for a $50 family membership or higher will receive a really special Valentine from the Gerald Ford Foundation, a box of gourmet chocolates from Mokaya Artisan Chocolates and Confections in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So the chocolates are wonderful, but we really depend on the support of our members to help us bring together partners like White House Historical Association and the Library and Museum to provide educational programming like what you enjoyed tonight. So Matt and Lina, thank you for the work that you do. For our friends at home, thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your evening.